As long as the world is turning and spinning, we're gonna be dizzy and we're gonna make mistakes. This is Vaguely Scientific. I'm Henry VIII, I'm Henry VIII, I am actually Derek. John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt, his name is not Jim's name. Hi, Jim.
Hi.
And this is the song that never ends. Yes, it goes on and on. Here's Anne. Hello, Anne.
Hi. Oh, sorry, you wanted something clever? I don't have anything clever.
Oh, that's okay. My thing was barely clever. Hardly clever. Not clever. Not.
Vaguely clever.
Vaguely clever?
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe. Speaking of things that are vague, this is the show where listeners send in questions to hear our vaguely scientific answers. And who knows, we might even get some of those answers right. But first, it's time for Jim's fun science fact of the day. Jim?
All right. In some species of anglerfish, the male latches onto the female and becomes a parasite. Eventually, his body just kind of fuses with hers. But she does get a steady supply of fertilized eggs from the bargain, which is, I guess, good if you're an anglerfish.
Well, they do need to reproduce, right?
Yeah. It's probably hard because, like, being down there so far and there's no light, like, anglerfish got to make their own light.
Oh, yeah, that is anglerfish.
Mm-hmm. They are scary. Not like I'm not afraid of an actual anglerfish, but like they look very scary. They got the big teeth, they got the big mouth. There's a great scene in Finding Nemo about this.
I confess that I don't have any sense of the size of anglerfish, and I feel like that is a pretty big factor in how scary they are.
Yeah, I don't think they're huge. I think they're maybe like a foot or two long.
They're about a meter long.
Oh, a meter. Okay, so bigger than I thought. Not as big as me, though.
That's like the length, though. That's not huge.
They could take a pretty sizable bite out of you, though.
Could they? Because I don't know if they're designed to eat smaller fish.
What kind of bite pressure does an anglerfish have?
We're going too far on this tangent.
We should use animal speak and ask them.
Oh, whoa. That sounded like a segue.
It would be a segue. But before we move on to our first question, Before we move on to our first question this week, we have some housekeeping to clear up in a segment we haven't done in a while. Because we've had no reason to, because we never make mistakes. This is stuff we got wrong and actually bothered to look up later. And in our last episode, Jim mentioned that Saturn's tilt meant that during some times of its year, its rings are edge on to Earth, and they seem to disappear. He thought this was going to happen in 2027, but it turns out it's actually much sooner than that. They'll be briefly vanishing in March of 2025.
Yeah, it's coming up.
Yeah, so that is much sooner.
It's close enough that if somebody's listening to the back catalog in about a year, they have missed it.
Oh, well,
I'm sure there will be pictures.
You too could just briefly vanish in March 2025 and just call that a day.
Just call it a day.
Yeah, if I was the rings, I'd pack it in. I wouldn't come back.
And we'd get rid of them forever. Oh, that was our question. Well, speaking of talking to anglerfish, we do have our first question. And our first question this week is, considering the average intelligence of beasts, how useful could the Speak with Animals spell actually be? This is a Dungeons and Dragons spell, but I did little to no research about D&D for this one.
I also did no research because it occurs to me now they use the term beast very specifically, and I'm like, wait, that probably means something.
It just means
Yeah.
non-magical animals, I think. So, like, animals we have in the real world.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I noticed that Speak with Animals specifically says in like the text of the spell, it specifically points out verbal communication. So I'm assuming, I mean, and this is also like, you know, based on what your DM is going to say, like yes or no to whatever. But like, because it sort of specifically points out verbal communication, maybe that means you can't speak to an animal that doesn't use sound as part of its communication repertoire.
Ooh, that's interesting, and it's interesting that you say DM discretion, because I have a rant about this.
Okay. Well,
I was playing a game. I'm not going to say what game, and I'm not going to name any people. But if they happen to listen to this, they'll know who they are, and they'll know I'm upset about it. I was playing a game where I had a character who was able to speak to birds. And for whatever reason, we were trying to track down rumors about a puma or some kind of large cat hunting tourists in a park. And this was kind of like a modern setting game. And I decided, well, I speak with birds. It's nighttime. And the storyteller had described that there were owls about. So I said, oh, well, wouldn't you know it? That's exactly what my character can do. So I asked this owl if he had seen any pumas. And the storyteller said, the owl doesn't know what the word puma means.
Oh,
and I took issue with that, because if I'm speaking owl language, I feel like I would use whatever word translated to large hunting cat.
Yeah.
That's it. That's my whole rant.
I mean, I think that's fair because, like, sure, it's a spell, which I think implies that it has like a magical translational component to it. Like, that it is not making you speak that language. It is making you speak, and there's an understanding between the two different languages, basically, as I understand it. Like, you don't suddenly start speaking owl.
Right.
So it would just auto-translate that, I would think.
Part of the question does take into account the intelligence of beasts, right? So it maybe is assuming they don't have the vocabulary, but I would also argue that, and this is kind of my main point, that ultimately, most things I would want to communicate with an animal about, and this is based on, frankly, just my personal experience as a person who likes animals and has pets, is some version of safe or not safe. I don't necessarily need to, like, have a philosophical conversation with them, but like that example of, you know, have you seen a puma around would just be like have you seen something that is killing cats? You, like, or where is the danger or something, like,
well, and I was kind of reading, in a real world scenario, you could maybe do something to like strengthen human-animal relationships. And I know a long time ago we talked about if you could speak to horses, you could like tell horses to like hold still for medical procedures and stuff. Yeah. And you could like calm them down.
You could tell them not to turn into centaurs.
I would prefer horses not turn into centaurs. But that whole, you're going to ask animals something that it's reasonable that they would know, and that's like where to find food or where to find shelter or where is or are they going to kill you? You know, that's a good question to maybe ask. But kind of part of that other rant, and that's kind of why I think it's interesting that it says how useful would this spell actually be, because like there's not a whole lot else you could get from, like, you couldn't get motives of, you couldn't like interrogate some animals or interview them as like witnesses to a crime or something.
One of the things I was thinking about was also the fact that there are going to be certain concepts which just don't translate to
I have that written.
certain
Yeah.
animals. And the example that we always go back to is just like snakes don't feel joy. So I don't know how you'd communicate joy to a snake. I guess you wouldn't. But I mean, there are going to be certain instances where you're trying to talk to an animal and they don't understand abstract concepts like that because they don't have the same emotional skill set that a human does, basically.
I mean, maybe, but like, why are you trying to talk to them? Because like,
True. Yeah.
are you trying to ask them practical things, or are you suddenly inquiring to a snake about their quality of life? Like, is that a conversation you genuinely want to have regularly?
Do you
Like,
prefer it
I don't-
in this in
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to have political debates with the animals.
Yeah. Snake, do you strongly disagree or strongly agree, or are you neutral about the quality of your job?
Would you rate your service on a scale of 1 to 10?
Like, I don't know. It's when you say practical, like, yeah, you can't. We assume you can't have those kind of conversations with certain animals, but also, are you saying that this spell is purely so you can have like late night philosophical discussions with anything that is within your region? Because like, why?
Let me jump on that because I feel like what we've already said is probably the most useful use of this spell in a real world scenario or like a fantasy game scenario where it's like you can ask where the danger is, or you can ask if something recently has passed by or something like that. But every time I've ever been in a scenario where somebody used speak with animals in a game, it was purely because my character has a pet dog and I want them to talk to it. And that's where I've often run. It is a very common, like, I guess, comical reaction to have people ask. Let's use the example of the dog. Ask the dog some questions, and for the game master of the game to just say, okay, the dog is talking to you. It wants food. It says, oh, do you have food? Do you have snacks? And that's like all. Right. They won't get anything useful out of it. And while
play,
yeah. Like, while I think that actually makes sense, like functionally, it does kind of make it seem like a lot of times the spell is not really giving any benefit. I don't know. From a gameplay mechanic standard, I guess.
I feel like the only time I've actually used anything like that is when I've actually needed something from a strange animal. Because so I did a one shot not too long ago that Justin was running actually, and I was a druid and I was able to we were traversing this mountain and I was able to convince this very large eagle to let us pass, because the eagle was not hostile, but it had like a nest and it was really worried we were going to try to, like hurt the babies. And so I was able to talk to the bird and be like, hey, no, we're just going up the mountain because this thing's happening. And that worked. But I've also only ever been a druid one time. So
So in response to that exact scenario where you are conveying that you are not a threat to the animal, like you are conveying something to the animal rather than getting information from the animal, that's kind of where it gets tricky for me. And Jim, you already mentioned this with the giving animals like understanding of concepts they might not. Because that kind of like, just because you can understand what they're saying doesn't mean you could communicate to this bird that does not speak English or understand what you are, that you're not going to hurt it just by saying that. So I think that's kind of interesting.
And that's something that is, I think, universal to, well, I guess there are plenty of animals that don't really care about their young necessarily. But I feel like a lot of those tend to be on the aquatic side of things, which are things you're going to talk to anyway. You're not going to be Mr. Limpet talking to a fish over here.
I wish.
Yeah.
I wish.
I wish I was a fish. One thing that I was kind of sad about as I was going through the going through the list of animals that I thought would be interesting to communicate with is that if it is a verbal thing, then you won't be able to talk to bees. And I just think that would be an interesting experience.
I thought about that.
Outside of the realm of D&D and the context that this spell exists, I would like to say that we definitely have tried our very human best to speak to animals. There's been other experiments, I'm sure, but like the virality of the dog buttons.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, if you are unfamiliar, people have buttons that have like one word programmed into them, and they've taught their dog to like press them, and it'd be like, you know, want walk now or something. And they're very simple concepts, but there have been some videos of dogs expressing like existential things. Like there was one dog that was like, "Why dog?"
Yeah. Why dog?
Right. So it's like we can debate all day about whether or not the dog actually has any concept of that. Right? But I think that very simple things that if animals are intelligent enough to hear us repeat words, like we know you can train dogs to respond to certain words, and regardless of if they know the meaning, they have learned, okay, you know, sit means sit. And speak to animals when we talk about, oh, you know, I'm trying to tell this bird that I'm safe, but they don't understand the concept of safe. I feel like we can maybe assume that even if they don't understand the existential concept of it, we can train them to be like, hey, when humans say this thing, this is kind of what it means. Or like, if I say safe, maybe it doesn't even mean safe, but like, you know, to stay there, like stay where you are. Also in the concept of D&D, this is a world in which I assume your average everyday animals encounter magic with shocking frequency.
Well, probably.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think the point of like, we desperately want to be able to communicate, especially with pets, with animals that we have bonded with.
Right.
In a way that like is satisfying to us. But it's like, they understand us enough that I don't necessarily know that speak to animals is a stretch. It would just kind of maybe assume take out the training.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That's interesting because we have you're mentioning the dog buttons, and the first thing I thought about was sign language with gorillas.
Oh, yeah.
And that also speaks to the intelligence of the specific animal, and also the idea that we can't necessarily understand whether the dog comprehends how existential it's being. We can't actually, you know, verify whether another human being has those kinds of thoughts. We can only think that for ourselves. And I know I've mentioned this before, and it's kind of an old story, but when they taught gorillas to use sign language, they learned that the gorillas would answer questions, but they would never ask questions. Like it just wasn't their natural way of exploring the world to ask questions in a language.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Why dog?
Why dog?
I think that gets into the nitty-gritty of like, what do you consider when the question says the average intelligence of beast? Like, what are you considering intelligence? Like, can they learn words? Yeah, probably a lot of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we have like crows that can use tools and
that are like as smart as 3-year-olds.
Yeah. And then you have octopus and dolphins is the debate there.
Mm-hmm. There have been a lot of instances where people have been trying to communicate with dolphins in the past, and I don't think there's ever been like any kind of clear like, oh yeah, we've said a couple words to these dolphins, but I feel like I've heard a lot of attempts have been made with that particular ones.
It's because we keep misinterpreting their attempts to communicate as doing silly tricks for fish.
Yes, correct.
I mean, I'd also point out when they talk about like how useful would the spell be, right? Again, it's what do you mean by useful? Do you mean useful to us personally? Because I also think that in real life, not necessarily in the world of D&D, but like in real life, if we could have a speak to animals spell, Man, that would be so helpful in terms of, like, conservation and, like, helping protect
Ooh, yeah.
species that, again, if you could convey and boil everything down to the concept of safe, not safe, like, I would love to tell all the deer in my neighborhood that, like, hey, roads, not safe. Don't do it.
Yeah, there's cars there. They're bigger than you. I think that's interesting, and I'd actually written down that I think that if we could make this spell a real thing, it would actually be more useful in real life than in a fantasy setting.
That's true. Although, I can think of a lot of instances where a lot of the same like use cases might show up. Like if you have, I don't know, like a police dog or something that's on the trail of some kind of aroma, and you could ask like, oh, what are you smelling? And they'd be like, oh, I smell the guy whose sock you gave me. And it's like, oh, okay, we're on the right track. Or they're like, oh, I smell a squirrel. It's like, wait, don't do that. You're on the job. Don't go after the squirrel.
I will say that if a dog is trained to scent lead, they're trained to alert, and like you just know by how they're reacting that they're following the correct smell.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think that would be super. And the other one I was thinking of for some reason was like animals that take part in sporting events. So like, because it's the Olympics, I was thinking of equestrian dressage, which is not the best example, but like you could really, like you said, you could really train a horse in a hurry.
What other animals take? Like there's animal only things, I suppose, like dog racing, and are there any sports that use any animals other than horses?
Cattle roping, I guess, in the sense that the cattle is also there.
Oh
yeah, I guess
rodeos.
So. Oh, and then I was thinking of fox hunting, which I don't like considering a sport.
No. Also, I don't think you'd want to talk to the fox.
I mean, I would, but I also wouldn't be hunting.
You would be a terrible fox hunter.
I'm okay with that accolade.
I have
a terrible fox hunter.
I have a deep and abiding issue with the spell. How I see it often used, at least in the game context, is a lot of times people will utilize talk to animals in the sense of like convincing animals to attack their enemies for them.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So it's like, if you have a
war
swarm of
elephants.
birds, right, like if you have a swarm of birds, you're going to go, like, send them to peck out your enemy's eyes. And I would never, ever want to do that, because then I would feel bad, because the animals could get hurt. So, like, again, talk is speak to animals.
Druids are the most evil of...
But here, my thing is, like, also, there's another layer to this spell, because we're assuming speak to animals is just speak to them, right? Like, we're talking about concepts. Do we have to elaborate things to them? But is the spell imposing a layer of will on it? Is it speak to animals or command animals? Because, like, how long do you spend having to convince the birds? Like...
Yeah.
It depends how far you want to take it, because just speaking broadly about the idea of the spell, you could go that far, but in D&D, as I'm familiar with it, speak with animals is just communication, but there are more powerful spells that allow you to bond with animals, and then further spells that allow you to like dominate animals and actually control them. And that would be, you'd have to define the term of whether or not speaking to animals is forcing them to communicate with you, or if it's just allowing you to understand them.
Mm-hmm. And I think that would also be another case of like DM discretion, which I imagine I can't blanket statement that, but based on the wording of the spell, I would assume that there's not really any kind of like layer of control, but a DM can do whatever they want to, really.
I mean, humans also, when we speak to other humans, we lie.
True.
So
yeah.
So
you could attempt to deceive an animal.
Yeah, like, you could try to trick them into it, but, like, I don't know. I think we've had this conversation on this show before, that I will always choose an animal over a person. So I hesitate about spells where it's, like, speak to animals, but also, like, we might lie to them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, what if animals are just jerks, and they say mean things about us behind our backs? I bet crows do.
Yeah, but they're probably right, is the thing.
Fair.
Again, What if we use this in the real world? Like, what if you cast a spell and then you can't turn it off, and like your cat just starts telling you everything they think about you for the rest of your?
That's good. You gotta have somebody take care of that cat for you because you just won't be able to be around it anymore.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just like bad roommates. You just don't get along once you can actually.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Cat up for adoption, looking for a good home. Perfectly good cat. It's just very rude to me, and I can understand it. That's the problem.
It doesn't agree with my lifestyle choices. It thinks I should have gone to med school.
Only problem is very judgy.
My cat doesn't think we landed on the moon.
My cat probably doesn't believe in the moon, actually.
They have no concept of what the moon is. It took us a long time to like study it and stuff and make observations about how things moved in the sky. Oh, this is going in a weird direction.
Is not the point of this show?
You watch it.
I listened to it, but okay.
I knew that was coming. Let's move on.
Well, I think it's time to wheel out one of my personal favorite intermission segments, Oopsie Daisy. Derek's got a good one in store for us. What'd you bring to the table here today, my friend?
Well, in March of 1989, electrochemists Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Pons announced they had achieved cold fusion in a laboratory setting.
All right.
They claimed to have observed excess heat production in a simple electrochemical cell that contained heavy water, deuterium oxide, and a palladium electrode. Their announcement was groundbreaking because it suggested a potential new source of virtually limitless and clean energy. However, other scientists had difficulty replicating Fleischmann and Pons' results consistently. Critics pointed out that the observed excess heat could have been due to potential flaws in the experimental setup or misinterpretations of readings and poor measurement techniques. By the early 1990s, the scientific community largely reached a consensus that the initial claims of cold fusion were incorrect. The U.S. Department of Energy conducted a review in 1989 and another in 2004, both concluding that there was insufficient evidence to support cold fusion as a viable energy source. Despite the discrediting of the original claims, some researchers continue to investigate cold fusion and related phenomena, often rebranded as low-energy nuclear reactions, LENR. They argue that there might be undiscovered mechanisms or conditions under which cold fusion could occur. However, these efforts remain on the fringes of mainstream science and have yet to produce definitive, reproducible evidence of cold fusion.
That'd be cool. Oh, wait, I didn't even... That would be nice, is what I meant to say.
Oopsie
it would
daisy.
Be handy. Oopsie daisy, guys. I did a pun.
Yeah.
I wish we could get ourselves some cold fusion.
I always think it's interesting when things like this that are so well known in the cultural zeitgeist, like cold fusion is a thing that I hear talked about in science fiction so often, and debunking this particular claim took them until 2004. So I think that's way more recent than I expected.
Yeah.
I genuinely didn't know there was a real source of the term cold fusion because it was used in science fiction so much. I thought it was literally just
fair.
We've made up this utterly impossible thing, and I didn't realize people were legitimately trying for that. Well,
cold fusion is just kind of like one of the later things in a string of perpetual motion claims, and charlatans have been quote unquote demonstrating perpetual motion since the early 1600s, as far as I've read. So it is in that same vein. So I just kind of always assumed it was that type of claim. I guess exactly what you said. I thought it was just a science fiction thing.
I always think it's interesting because it's also one of those things where in the same way that we talked about, this was very long time ago. I can't remember if this was an oopsie daisy or what this was, but we talked about polywater.
Oh yeah,
which
that
is
was
like the polymer of water, and it turned out that it was just like some dude was not cleaning his
it
lab
was
equipment
just
well.
dirty water.
Yeah, and it's like one of those things where it's very exciting, and it's like, oh, this is maybe a big breakthrough, and then if you clean your labware, it doesn't. It all falls apart. So it's hard to say if it was just like they misread what they were getting, or if like they had like faulty equipment or what. But it was exciting for a bit, and it took a while to sort of like figure out that there's not really anything here.
Yeah, and it was just like measuring poorly.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that wraps up our little middle segment for this episode. But we do have a second question that I think we should tackle here. And question 2 comes to us from Adam. I should, I guess, say as a disclaimer, it comes from a friend of Adam's, but since I don't have a name associated to it and I heard it from Adam, I'm attributing it to Adam. What is objectively the best piece of playground equipment, taking into account safety, fun, affordability, historic significance, and any other categories deemed relevant? Swing set.
Before we get into it, I just wanted us all to say, like, do we all have a top one?
I do.
Like, we all have like an answer.
I have
to
a couple
this question?
actually. I guess I don't have them really ranked, which is the whole prompt. So I don't know what I did.
I'm going to start with the classic, the evergreen, the most natural of all playground equipment, and that is the sandbox. Now, the sandbox doesn't really feel like equipment because, you know, it's a box filled with sand. But on a list of the top 10 very best types of playground equipment, it was on that list. So I'm going to count it. And as a kid, I loved sandboxes because you could do anything in a sandbox. You can bring along your own toys, get them all dirty. You can build whatever you want. You can make the sand wet and make it even better to build with. So sandboxes are up there for me.
Okay.
I wouldn't necessarily say they're like at the tippy top, but I could spend an hour or two in a sandbox.
I need to remind the listener that Jim never had a cat.
I don't think cats are playground equipment.
The litter box for children.
Yeah. Well, that's the yeah. If you had a cat, your sandbox became a litter box.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah. I also put a lid on my sandbox.
I want to be clear, I didn't grow up with a cat, and neither does my neighbor, but both of those sandboxes were filled with similar things just from nature.
Yeah, lids are helpful.
But yeah, I used to like taking things out to the sandbox. I used to get those like those 1.5 inch tall little Pokemon figures and the 1.5 inch tall little Digimon figures, and they don't get dirty because they're just solid injection molded plastic. So you could do all kinds of stuff in the sandbox with those.
I used to go to the beach a lot as a kid, and I enjoyed building stuff with sand, but I never had a sand box in my own yard.
You did.
It did not. No, it was a litter box.
Oh, right. Yeah, gotcha. Fair. But yeah, I mean, a beach is just a sandbox. So it's kind of like, in a way, it's like a cop-out answer. But I do love a sandbox. I love a beach, too.
So ultimately, if you're saying that the beach and a sandbox is the same thing, or like the equipment that you're making the case for is box.
It's
like,
box,
yeah.
yes.
Box.
Oh, and just like cats, you know.
I didn't think about sandbox, which is interesting because I think it fits the criteria perfectly for a playground equipment, a thing that would be on a playground. All of the things that I listed have some level of danger attached to them. Which was...
Well, that's the beauty of the sandbox. There's very little danger attached to it.
It's very little.
Except getting sand in your eyes and your underwear.
Kids eat the sand on a shockingly regular basis.
Well, yeah, but how dangerous is eating sand, though?
Well, let me give you some of the ones that I looked up here. So I ultimately broke down some of these things into safety and fun, which is completely subjective, affordability, historic significance, because that was put in there, and inclusivity, I thought was a good thing to add. So, and I was polling a few people about these and trying to put together some numbers. I don't have any hard numbers because that was way too much work. So I listed swing set and seesaws and merry-go-rounds and slides and jungle gyms. I want to hold on to jungle gyms for a little later in the episode, though.
Yeah. I also put mine at the bottom.
I just have some things to say about it.
As do I. That's why I put it for last.
Okay. I learned that seesaws apparently are one of the older things on this list.
Oh.
And we don't actually know exactly when seesaws as a child's toy really became a thing, but it is believed that it was in the 17th century in Korea that it became popular, that children who were not allowed to leave the walls of their like home courtyards and stuff invented the seesaws to catapult themselves up high enough that they could like look out into the world outside, but there's nothing.
I think you're gonna say catapult over the wall.
Well, just to lift, catapult up.
Yeah.
And there's no real hard evidence for that, but it is apparently a commonly believed thing. And I learned that the trampoline, there's another one, has a lot of different possible origins. And the safety rating of a trampoline is very low. But apparently they think that can be traced back to ancient China, Egypt, or Persia with circus acts, basically, which would basically just be people using tightened blankets to help like throw people up in the air, kind of like a rubber banding effect. That's pretty high on my ranking for fun. Pretty low on my ranking for danger. But also I want to say that danger is also a little subjective, because much like children eating sand, that's kind of user error on that. Most of the people that I talk to put slides pretty high on their list for things that are generally safe. I learned that the earliest known slide was built in 1902 in Washington, D.C.
That seems awfully recent.
Right? So that's the earliest known slide specifically designed for a playground.
Okay. Yeah. So like kids were sliding down the hills during caveman times and that didn't count.
Right. Well, because it was a specifically designed piece of thing. But if you happen to go off the slide in the wrong direction, it can be incredibly dangerous. Sometimes children can break their collarbones doing that. So I think slides are incredibly dangerous.
I've never heard of anyone ever doing that.
I've heard of one.
One thing I do want to mention before we go too far away from it, though, is that seesaws I don't find tremendously fun.
Okay.
They're like fun for 5 to 10 minutes maybe, and then that's about it. I prefer a trampoline quite a bit, actually. They're a lot safer now because now the trampolines have the netting around them, so you can't fall off quite as easily.
My immediate reaction to your fact about seesaws is like, how low were those walls? Because seesaws do not go that high.
Maybe they were beefy seesaws.
So the idea of it being that they were attempting to like leap off of them, I think, is the way the stories are told. But also that anecdote could be completely made up.
But like, if you're trying to do that, wouldn't a swing, I feel like, would be infinitely better. Because like you can get more height and also more launch to get over things. And also that segues into swings are the best playground equipment. That's my opinion.
Well, that's also the top of my list because they're pretty simple. They're just a rope. You can put any kind of seat on them. They're affordable because they're just, bare minimum stuff. And I also wanted to the category that I added, inclusivity, like slides. People who have disabilities can't necessarily climb up the slides. For swings, they encourage community use. So like someone can be pushed on a swing, and you can hang any kind of seat on a swing. So that's up there, and also it is less likely for you to go off of them the wrong way and break your collarbone.
Right.
Swings are also really high on my list for all the reasons you mentioned. I do want to point out also that they do make specifically accessible swings. Not just like, oh, you can put any kind of seat on them, but like there are swings that have been designed that you can like get a wheelchair onto that like locks into a platform.
Yeah, they're modular.
Yeah, like there's way more variations on swing from like, a literal rope you can put up in your backyard, except tire swings, because like, man, that's one way to make a swing worse.
You know, tire swings are a separate category. They're lower.
No, I do not like them. But I also want to point out that swings are one of the few pieces of like traditional playground equipment that adults frequently carry over into their adult life. Like people love the idea of hammock chairs and like porch swings and even like indoor like woven swings in the house. And like part of that is like societal, like it's accepted, whatever, but the comforting motion of even just casually being on like a porch swing rocking chair is a soothing motion. Like grandma's not going real hard on her porch or anything, like trying to launch herself over the wall, but it's something that is so universal that like we've wanted to hold on to it even beyond the playground.
You're right. Well, yeah, because front porch swings that you mentioned, like it's a thing that there's a lot of I guess it's a very college thing that I've seen a lot of people hanging those swinging hammocks like over higher heights just to have this like, hey, it's like a surface I can swing on where there isn't a floor. And that's just like everybody thinks that's neat, I guess.
One thing though I will mention about the swing is that it's one of those things that does take a little bit of physical exertion, which I mean most playground equipment does, but like if you get tired easily, you're not going to be able to pump the swing super duper well. But if someone's pushing you, not as big of a deal. Right. That's the life.
And it teaches like kind of cooperation. And
there are also multiple ways to make a swing move as well, because you say pump, like I'm assuming you're picturing a traditional swing where you like swing your legs. Yeah. But also there are other ones that use, I remember on my like jungle gym when I was growing up, there was one that you kind of like stood on and like leveraged the bars. So you were using only your arms.
Oh yeah.
To move with. So like, again, there's plenty of modifiers like that you don't, right? Like you don't necessarily have to use only one mode of operating it, or you could just kind of like get on it at an angle and let gravity take over for as long as it can move you.
Yeah.
Like if I mount a swing backwards, I feel like there's more. I'm gonna make a case for the swing. I like them.
Yeah,
I think that's what I settled on as my top too. So like, I think you're just right.
Yeah, honestly, the swing was the top of my list too.
Okay, so. Well we solved it.
This became less controversial than I was expecting.
That did bring out a memory, though, that I really liked. My cousins had a swing set when they were kids that had a kind of like what you were describing, a glider where there were like these two bars with your feet, and you'd push against the bars to make it, and you'd keep going because you were like pumping it through pushing with your feet, and that was really fun because there was like a bench that swung back and forth, and you could get that thing to go pretty high.
Oh yeah, I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, so that's up there as well, right up there with the regular swing, is the fun glider swing that they had when we were all kids.
I want to touch on, I've written up a little bit of information here, speaking specifically about historical significance of the jungle gym.
Oh, okay.
And I have to credit that a lot of this information, pretty much all of this information, comes from an old Tom Scott video, which I'll try to find and put in the show notes. Jungle Gym is actually a trademark name for what the generic version is a climbing frame. And that's what they call it in places that aren't America. And it was patented by a man named Sebastian Hinton. The first one was installed in 1920 near a school in Chicago. And the idea was that it was safe to climb because there were so many handholds throughout it that it was virtually impossible, quote from the patent, for a child to fall all the way through it. Ignoring the fact that a child could easily get hurt by hitting their head on one of the bars, and then ragdoll on the way down. That didn't occur to them. It was also suggested that it be placed around a swimming pool so that they had water to fall into instead of the hard ground. Also not a great idea.
Oh man, they can fall unconscious into water.
Yeah.
That's a great plan.
It's super safe. 10 out of 10. But here's where it's interesting and why I wanted to bring it up, because in the original patent, there is a reference to playing a game called three-dimensional tag. And Sebastian Hinton, who I said patented the Jungle Gym, his father, Charles Hinton, actually invented it. Charles Hinton was a mathematician who famously studied the mathematics of the fourth dimension and actually invented the word tesseract, if you're familiar with that. And Sebastian reported that his father built a climbing frame for him when he was a kid and would have the children in the neighborhood climb on it and learn basically three-dimensional coordinates that he would call out, and they'd have to race to them. And here's what's fascinating about all of that. Hinton's idea was that humans mostly move in two-dimensional space. We walk parallel to the earth. But we understand three dimensions. So if children were trained to move in three-dimensional space while their brains were still developing, they might more easily understand four dimensions. That didn't work, but jungle gyms were still very fun to climb on. So I think that it was all like a training children to expand their minds originally.
Interesting.
On the note of expanding kids' minds, I will say also on my list, not necessarily as the best piece of playground equipment for multiple reasons, including accessibility, but a piece of equipment that I think is underrated is the little, some sort of raised fort with a rope ladder or a bridge over to it.
I thought about that.
And it's just, that's not, right, it's not necessarily a ride, quote unquote, like a swing or a slide or anything like that, but it's just, the sense of, encouraging play and, imagination.
Yeah.
I think the general fort led to an awful lot of, scenarios that kids would come up with. So I think in terms of encouraging creativity, the less the equipment moves, similar to Jim, your point with the sandbox, the less the equipment moves itself, the more kids are encouraged to kind of come up with more creative ways for it.
Sure. And that's an interesting note, because when you're talking about childhood development and you're talking about, we're trying to say what is objectively the best based on a number of criteria, but there are things that encourage athleticism and there are things that encourage creativity. And so there is not going to be a single tool or a single piece of equipment that is perfect for every criteria, I think.
Yeah.
Do you guys have opinions on what the worst thing is? Because I sure do.
Slides.
Boy.
Slides.
That's not my opinion, no. I was actually thinking, so there are those things that are small animals on a spring that you climb onto and they go forward and backward.
Yeah.
And those are fine, but I have the same opinion about something like that as I do about a seesaw. It's fun for 5 minutes and then I'm over it, because there's not really any imagination you can get in on that kind of thing.
Okay.
I don't know if this
Valid
counts,
points.
but on the on the note of, just because it's another random thing I knew, Charles Hinton, the guy who I was just talking about, also designed the first baseball pitching machine, and it was powered by gunpowder, and it didn't work.
Jesus.
Super great. I love it.
That's a baseball cannon.
It's I did not look up like how it actually works, so that's what I'm picturing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a contender for worst.
I don't know if that counts as playground equipment, though, does it? Like a pitching machine?
No, it's a loose thing.
All right. So my least favorite playground equipment is very specific, but I hate it. So here we go. In relation to those big jungle gym complexes that have like the little like fort thing or like a bridge or, basically different kinds of platforms that go to slides and things, inevitably, somewhere on them, along one of the railings, there are 3 poles with little cubes on them. That is the saddest tic-tac-toe game.
Oh, yeah.
And you just spin them, and they do nothing, and they never even stay where you put them. What is the point of that? You could do one thing with them, and it's the worst thing.
It's weird.
Tic-tac-toe is not a popular sport, or not a sport game. It's also not a popular sport.
It's not a popular sport.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't think of those because I've seen maybe 2 of those, and I guess I didn't realize how prominent they were.
They were on every playground I encountered as a child. Even as a child, I was annoyed by their existence. And I don't, because what you go up to them as a kid and you expect them to do something or light up, or I don't even know, but it's just, they just sadly spin, and maybe one of them doesn't spin because it's been in the weather too long, and it's just what? If you want kids to have that kind of intellectual stimulation that theoretically it's there for, there are better ways.
Just have them do algebra.
I was gonna say though, because I have a toddler, we go to a lot of different playgrounds, and all of them have that, and I've never seen another child ever try to play tic-tac-toe.
Exactly, it's the worst.
Yeah,
I thought of one that I did think of when I was writing my notes, but I didn't write it down because I didn't know what to search for. But so I'll try to describe this, and I want to kind of say jungle gyms are not safe. They're not a safe thing. They're not the least safe thing in the world, but they're dangerous because you're talking about children. But I still enjoy them. So my criteria kind of ignores safety a little bit, which is why I think trampolines are also fun. I've encountered 2 of these. One was at a park, and it was in a big sand pit. And it was essentially a barrel that was on an axle. And you held onto these hand rails and you kind of ran on the barrel. And there was another one that was much, much bigger that was at a lake that we used to go swimming at when I was a kid. And it was big enough that 3 people could stand on this thing, but it didn't have handholds. And it was essentially like looking at the front wheel of a steamroller. But you could stand on it and run and try to shift your weight.
Oh,
and,
okay. I know exactly what you're talking about now.
Okay. It is not the one that I'm thinking of was not a safe piece of equipment at all, because you could easily slip, hit your head on it, and then drown. However, I thought it was very fun to play on, as did many of the kids I grew up with. So that's where I'm struggling to figure out what the worst one is, in my opinion, because all of my favorite things to play on were terrible ideas.
Well, you bring up a good point there too, because it seems probably not safe in the first place, but handlebars versus no handlebars, the design of the particular equipment, what it's made out of, probably makes a pretty big difference. Like, look at slides, plastic slides, delightful, fun for the whole family. Metal slides, death. Like,
no, metal slides are terrible and should be destroyed.
Yeah, so it's like, I'm sure there's like this level of like, oh yeah, there's a good version of it, and then also there's a version of it that's made by people who like just hate children, I guess.
Or it's made for people who like they want to play on it themselves and they don't necessarily care about like marketing it or putting up safety precautions, which like is weird that it was in a public park.
Right.
But
I mean, I'll also say that, and this is an absolute personal anecdote, that so I had one of those like A-frame jungle gyms growing up where it's like the little pyramids and a couple swings in between. And those poles were metal, but the thing came with like pool noodle foam to put around those for safety or whatever, so kids don't run into it. But what inevitably happened is me as a child decided, I just want to climb across the whole thing and not use it for its intended purpose. And then the foam immediately became a liability because it would like spin when you're trying to hold on to it, or rip or something.
Yeah. That reminds me of Ninja Warrior or those kinds of like obstacle course TV shows that like I will watch those shows on occasion and I'll look at them and I'll be like, I want to do that. And then inevitably somebody will be like, you're not in shape enough to do that. And I'm like, I'm not saying I could do it as well as they're doing it. I'm saying I want to play on the obstacles.
Yeah. I will say though that even amongst like all of the various like compound playground equipment that I've seen in parks over the last, let's say 3 years, like some are clearly better than others. And I think the ones that tend to have the most interesting things going for them are things that have like 2 layers. There's like a bottom thing, there's a top thing, there's at least one slide. There are at least 2 or 3 different ways that you can climb it. One of the things I think is really neat is like ones where it has like alternating steps where you can go up like a pole in the middle, and then like it's like a telephone pole thing where there's like alternating steps on each side. And also like if there are things that have like a common theme to them, like there's this one at this park that I think is really cool. My son thinks it's the best one that's like themed as a pirate ship. And that's cool. You gotta throw a little theme in there. Gives your imagination a little jump start.
There was a dinosaur in my elementary school. Well, listeners, let us know this week, how useful could playground equipment safety actually be? If you have any thoughts on that or anything else that we talked about this episode, you can email us at feedback@vaguelyscientific.com. You can comment on our blog, or you can like us on Facebook, or you can tweet @vaguelysci. Hey, Jim, where do we get all these wacky questions?
We get them from you, the listeners. And if you have a question that needs to be answered in a vaguely scientific manner, please email us at questions@vaguelyscientific.com. If you want to get our episodes the minute that they're released, you can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and all the other great places that cool podcasts like to hang out. And subscribing and leaving feedback really helps us out, and so does telling your friends.
And tell all your childhood friends that you used to play on playground equipment to listen to the show as a stretch.
Hey, if you got childhood friends, just let them know. Our vaguely musical intro is composed by Anthony Pizzelli, and don't forget to check out our merch store over at vaguelyscientific.threadless.com. If you want to get the perfect t-shirt to wear to the playground, that's the place to do it.
Yay!
Maybe don't wear the "everyone will probably die" shirt to the playground.
I forgot about that one. Everyone would probably die. So thank you to Anne for being our guest this week.
Thanks for having me.
Yay! For Vaguely Scientific, I am Derek.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Anne.
And second verse, same as the first.
Toodaloo, everyone.
And we do the whole episode again, just the same.
Yeah. We just make it double length.
Yeah. don't want the weather. I want a stopwatch.
How is the weather looking?
It's the same. It is the same button on my phone.
Any tornadoes?
It was storming real bad all day. It seems to have calmed down now. But rain was falling sideways and things were being knocked over.